Chaos. Woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning, chilling with coffee mugs, me and coffee chugs, talking education all across the nation, pushing boundaries, thinking innovation. Chaos.
Hello, everyone. How you doing? Welcome to another episode on Living on the Edge of Chaos podcast. I always start off saying I'm so excited for the guest, but this one I'm going to use a different word, and I honestly feel honored because this has been someone, and I know it's not just her, she's got a team behind her, but I have done and found most of my most recent learning around AI and thinking about applications to education through her work and her team's work and the just stuff we'll get into, the webinars, the resources, the courses, and all stuff they have that really is, I'm already getting long-winded here, but there's just so much out there that it can be daunting to anybody that's trying to wrap their head around it for the first time. And her team have put together some work that I think really is practical, it's helpful, and it just kind of helps you figure out how to take the first step for a lot of people where this is brand new. And so I'm speaking today with Amanda Bickerstaff and part of the AI for education. And I'll let her explain and talk through all that. But Amanda, really, I am truly honored. I mean that sincerely to have this opportunity to chat with you. But before we get going into all the fun, let's let people know who in the world you are in case your name is new to them. Who are you? What do you do? And, what in the world you got going on?
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak to someone about really education, but also generative AI right now I've gotten very boring. It's really what I think about all the time. And so it's just a pleasure to be here and I'm first and foremost an educator. I started as a teacher in a public school in the Bronx at 22 years old. I was a New York City teaching fellow. And so I had this formative experience of deeply, deeply understanding the complexity of teaching, but also the complexity of low and marginalized communities and how to support and think about teaching and working within those contexts or even going to school within those contexts. And so that was a very good learning for me that's really stuck with me my entire career. It was the hardest thing I ever did until my last job, which was I was an EdTech CEO in Australia. I am not Australian. My life has taken a lot of paths and to move to a new country where I didn't know. I mean, we love acronyms in education, and I swear I was the CEO of a company, and for 6 months I did not understand any acronym. So they're like ATAR and NAPLAN and like ETSL, and I just smiled and nodded my way through, and then suddenly over time they started to make sense to me. But that was I was there during COVID, and if you know, Melbourne was the most locked down place in the world, so I was in the most locked down place in the world. And so those are two really formative experiences for me about starting AI for education. The third is I'm a researcher. So I got most of a PhD. If anybody finished it, I appreciate you. I did not. I liked working too much and didn't like academic writing, which is all very funny because when I was in Australia, we did some of the biggest studies of their kind on the impact of COVID. So we published 4 papers in 16 months, which is hysterical because it would have been great to have a doctor in front of my name for all kinds of reasons, but also, I wish I could just retroactively get a PhD, just be like, hey, I did this stuff. People cited it. It's okay. But that's not how it works, unfortunately. And now I am the CEO and founder of AI for Education, which is those three, the teaching, my EdTech CEO background, and then my research background all kind of came together in this really interesting intersection because I've seen all parts of the education system. I've done all jobs. I've done everything from understanding what it means to be in the classroom to supporting teachers in the classroom to building technology for the classroom. And then on the other side, understanding the evidence base that needs to be there. So I managed to get myself super burnt out, which is probably unsurprising considering what I did to myself. And so I ended up traveling the world for 6 months, highly recommended if anybody could do that, and took a break and then came back to the US. And when I was thinking about what to do next, I used ChatGPT for the first time. And I always suggest this, if anybody's listening, my first tip for you all is if you're using generative AI for the first time, pick the thing you hate the most to do as an educator. And mine was rubrics. So one of the first company I helped build was this online professional development company called Salary Advancement Courses. And I was the only education person, and we did 200 courses in 20 months. And so every course had 3 rubrics. And so I either wrote every rubric or reviewed every rubric, and that's 600. And so if anybody can feel my pain out there, I am sorry. I still feel it. And the first thing I ever asked ChatGPT to do was like, here, build me a rubric. And when it built me a rubric in a table without me asking, I was done. I was like, this is something that is truly transformative. It is the disruption that we've been talking about forever in education. But at the same time, I know how hard it is to adopt new technologies. And this is not just a new technology. This is a magnitude change. So I started with AI for education, put up a website, a prompt library, have never built a website before. So that was fun. And it's been really cool. So it's been about 4 months now. Actually, today is 4 months since the website went up. And we've had this really great opportunity to work with educators from all around the world, trying to help them responsibly navigate the adoption of AI.
Oh, I love that. I mean, there's so much there. I mean, you could just take the podcast just to hear about your world travels. That would be fascinating enough in and of itself, and everything else that you've got going on. And I mean, I think just that right there in of itself proves the power of being a lifelong learner, which you obviously are. And maybe to kind of bridge this into some of this AI conversation, thinking about when you were in Australia, and I'm thinking about acronyms and how much we love that in education, and to immerse yourself in a country with all new acronyms, that's pretty much how a lot of people feel in the world of AI, acronyms or not. Just like, what is all this new terminology, and what is this chat GPT and prompt engineering and prompts, and all the stuff that comes with that. I know that because I've been on the webinars, I've seen your stuff, and I want to talk about some of the things that you guys have going on. But I want to start with a question before we get into that, because I'll get really excited about it. But as you're thinking about AI, you're thinking about education, in that broader space. What is it that you wish like more people ask you questions about or wanted to know about AI in terms of educational landscape that maybe you haven't had a chance to get out there? I mean, I know there's so much, but I'm just curious, in your own learning journey, congratulations on the 4 months of this new venture for you. Is there something that you're like, man, I wish people would ask me about this with AI? I'm really putting you on the spot, boy, right out of the gates here, but I'm just curious.
I love it. Oh man, you know what's really interesting is that I think that this is one of those peak times where it's very hard to figure out what the question is to ask. And so a lot of what we do is actually put stuff into the world so that people have something to respond to. And so what I would say is that I think it's just curiosity. I think it's just, I want people to be curious. Like, you can ask me any question. I will answer your questions. I've got a very yes kind of space right now. If people reach out to me on LinkedIn or through email, I try to take time and respond, because the curiosity is really important. And I know we're coming off of COVID fatigue. There's a lot of burnout. There's so many EdTech tools. There's so many expectations out of the classroom. And the one thing that the great place to start is like, how can this help you? How can this help you lower your administrative burden? How can it provide some support in places in which you haven't had it before? Lesson planning, it can be quite difficult. So ask me how you can lesson plan more quickly or more effectively, or take that take that little time that you have and actually create something that's more personalized for your classroom. Those things that are really hard for us to do because we're in this cognitive and mental overload a lot of times as educators, especially at the beginning of the school year, or if you're a new teacher, in this case, when we have a new technology. So I'd say just be curious, and I think that's the most important thing we can do. I start most of our PDs with take out your phone. Everyone take out your phone. And you already have AI. AI has been around for 70 years. Chatbots have been around for a long time. But the difference is we're moving from this idea of classical AI, where it's predictive text, Siri, recognizing your face. And what's happened is now we have this ability for technology to be accessed and to create with just words. So when people talk about all this, all these prompt engineering prompts, etc., all that means is that natural language, the way I'm talking to you today, if I was typing that and soon when I speak, instead of having to think through and building code to get something out of a computer system, now I can just say, build me a rubric with these pieces. And that's what we call a prompt. And if you get really good at prompt engineering, all that means is that instead of going back behind the scenes again and doing like if then statements and syntax and all that kind of stuff, you're just asking a really good question. And you're also being able to follow it up with even better questions, because it really is an assistant and or a partnership that you need to do. And so all of these things seem very, very hard, but in reality, because it's natural language focused, it is the easiest thing to do to get started. And so that's why we created a prompt library where you can just cut and paste, because we know that, like, my favorite is people are like, oh, it's like Google. So I'm going to go in and search like Google. And I'm like, it is not Google. In fact, it is worse. Google is not connected to the internet. It hallucinates, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. And so, but people will use it as Google and ask it like a simple thing, and it'll either give back something wrong or just not be very useful, because they don't have an understanding of like the difference. But if you just ask it, like, build me a travel plan, like you said, so Aaron, I'm saying, like, go on the trip with me. We're doing 6 months. Where should I go? I can now ask it, like, where, like, these are my interests. This is my itinerary. This is how much I want to spend. Help me plan something. And that is something that would take us, sometimes people spend 20, 30, 40 hours planning a trip. And instead it could take you like, a quarter to even, an hour of time. And I think that that's really the power, but it's not something that's intuitive. You have to have support to get there, because our intuitive nature is to use it the wrong way.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I think you hit on something that's key. I'm just thinking through some of the things I've done over the summer, working with educators at various places and some online stuff, and then also being participants and trying to figure out, how all this works and what it means for education. As we think about that prompt engineering or that prompt, I'm thinking back to like your example about, what's the one thing you hate doing for you, like rubrics, right? Like, where was that 600 rubrics ago when you had that job, right? You could put in some custom instructions and boom, you would have been going. And I think that's a really pivotal idea for a lot of people getting started, is like with anything, take all tools and tech and all the stuff away. What is it? What is our outcome? What's our desired endpoint that we're looking for? And sometimes people dive into this and they're like, I don't know what to do. It's not giving me what we want. But it's like, but what is it that you're after? And I think just like with anything, a good lesson plan, a good project, a good learning situation with AI or without, is knowing what your outcome, what you're hoping to achieve. And I think with this AI and these tools, it's the same thing. Like, what is it that you're after? Like you said, plan that itinerary. I've got this amount of days, I got X amount of dollars. I want to do these 3 things. Help me figure out how to do it. That's when it becomes really, really great at what would take, maybe hours or days to figure out. It can start just pushing stuff out in a matter of minutes. So I think that's a really, it seems so duh, but anything with tools, we just kind of think it's going to like read our minds and just magically know what to put out next.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that is really interesting, because it is, we're on this Facebook group, which anybody here, shout out Facebook group, the ChatGPT for Teachers. I enjoy it.
Yep.
Harry Pickens was the moderator for to do a webinar together. So like we're gonna do some stuff together. But what I would say is that what I see a lot is like, I just want it to do X, because I think we just want the cognitive offload of, I just want it to make slides. My favorite one, apparently the biggest pain point for teachers, this is my straw poll, is we hate creating slides for Google Classroom or whatever it may be. But computer vision is not great. So most of these tools, please don't pay for them unless you really, really like them. Don't work particularly well. But what I think is interesting is that it does take us down like a huge level, a magnitude down of that cognitive like work. But it's not, like you said, a mind reader. But what will happen, and so like prompt engineering, my hot take for today, or I'm sure this is only going to be one, is that prompt engineering as a skill is going to be gone and unnecessary in about 16 to 18 months. Because what's going to happen is this idea of prompt engineering, remember, is just where we're going in, we're knowing how to ask good questions, and it takes some time. What's going to happen is that's going to go behind interfaces in which it just says, enter these couple things, I'll give you this, or it'll use the data it's already been trained on to anticipate what you need. And then you're starting from a place of like a draft and then working on it together. So these things are coming. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't go and get in there. As educators, this is an ideal time to understand technology in a way that like has never been possible before for most of us. And it also has power in that. Like when an ed tech person comes in or a technologist comes in and says, hey, we're doing all this stuff, a lot of times we're like, okay, what's your proof? But now you can actually understand it. Like you can say, okay, so how are you, like, what are you using? What are the foundational models? Are you using ChatGPT? Or are you using Claude? Or what are you, like you can start to have conversations that are very deep because you're using the same stuff that these technologists are using to build their systems. And so there's that component of it, but also it's a great time to teach students about how these programs work. So generative AI as a model, so that they're understanding how to become critical users of this technology. So even when prompt engineering goes behind that kind of interface, it doesn't mean that it will be good or perfect. In fact, I'm going to bet you right now, hot take number 2 is that it's not going to be perfect, actually. It's going to tell you it's going to be like 95% good because these models themselves are not infallible and, in fact, are just predictive. And so with generative AI, it's going to make mistakes, some less, some more, depending on what you ask and what models you're using. But even when it's easier and easier, you still have to be able to identify when it's going to be used accurately and when it's not, when it's hallucinating, when it's not, et cetera. And so these are really great opportunities to get involved and to rethink what it means to be a teacher and to have power. Like this is power. Like you can actually create your own chatbot. And a lot of teachers are, and they don't have to be technologists. They just have to be really, really good at a thing. If you are the best instructional designer on, Bucks Institute PBL, or you are really, really great at Socratic questioning, or you are an expert in, early 20th century literature, I don't know, making, a lot of these different things, you can build a knowledge base and then create something, and you do not have to have a computer science degree.
Yeah, and that's what I think is like the beauty of helping people start to see themselves outside of like a lane that they sometimes place themselves in. And I think educators, and I mean this not as a diss by any means, like they are sometimes their own worst enemies. They label themselves in terms of like, this is what I can do, even though they spend every waking hour trying to help kids be the best version of themselves. They sometimes like put so many barriers on themselves, like they don't even realize how incredible they are and what they do in their craft all day, every day. And this is true for admin as well, to be able to see themselves doing exactly what you just said. They're like, no, I can't do that. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm not good at X. You know what I mean? Like the very things we try to help kids not have that mindset. Sometimes we do the very same thing in education, to ourselves. And I think that's, to me, one of the biggest things I've been trying to work through is like, how do we help? There's more mindset than even tech learning. Like, how do I get you to see that you are capable of using these tools, even though it might seem a little overwhelming at first? It might seem like one more thing. It might seem like, holy cow, how am I even going to process this with, kids and learning and all these things? And just realizing like, once you start to like just dab your feet within the ecosystem, like you'll come alive. And I watch it happen time and time again. My big thing is always like push back on it. Just try to challenge it. Like how be the kid in your class that drives you wild, and just see if you can break it, in a legal sense. Not that you're going to do anything illegal, but like just to see what happens. And all of a sudden now they're just, once they do that, boy, they hunker down. And I usually lose them for a while, but it's just trying to give them like that sense of like, you have permission to go try things. Like it's nothing bad is going to come of it, and you discover lots of things you talked about. Not everything's accurate. You got to start to analyze, you got to start to synthesize. And kind of leading up to my next question there is, I think one of the, at least in my mind, one of the misconceptions is, yes, there's that whole topic of cheating and plagiarism, which is everywhere, along with how do I get my slides created, which is in that Facebook group about every other post, but I think one of the big things is once people start to use it is that higher level thinking. Like you have to know how to synthesize and analyze and do some of that higher level thinking to be able to compare, contrast, and identify, in this case, the answer, to even know if it's valid or not valid, to be able to then, prompt the next segue of the learning or the outcome that you're after. So I'm curious, how do you navigate that, or how do you help people kind of maybe process through that? Not so much the, oh my God, every kid's going to cheat and it's easy path, because I know that's its own thing for its own flavor, but helping them see like you still have to be able to reason and critical thinking to use these tools effectively.
So, great question. There's a couple of things. One, we had a webinar about a month ago with students, 15 to 18-year-olds that were experts in AI. They actually do emerging tech and our students. And so Christian, who's 15, he was saying, well, if you can teach us that vaping is bad for us, why can't you teach us that ChatGPT can be bad for us too? And the point was that like there's real risk with cognitive offload with students and just general people at formative stages, whether that's your new job or you're learning in college or other pieces, where these neural networks, these things that you're building, right, the cognitive science of it, are really important, especially at younger ages. And so if to give it all away, so to speak, to a chatbot, it's going to impact you negatively. So I'll start there. So we do need to think about like how do you balance this, and then I'll just use our example how we do this. So we built a curriculum. Shout out to Michael Kingston who helped us do this. With 4 lessons. And the way that we design the 4 lessons is that not only are they for students, but I think they're also for teachers.
Yes.
Is the first one is just like, what is it? And let's do some prompt engineering. And what we're going to do is we are coining the term AI moves. So there's student moves and teacher moves in the classroom. If you're familiar with that, that's what teachers do and students do, and it's very common. But what can AI do in that classroom in a pedagogically sound way? So the first one we use is that the students actually create prompts, and then they go back and they ask ChatGPT what it is. And so they use the actual tool to like dive into and interview it. And so they start to understand what it is, how it's designed, how to interact with it. And so that's a starting place. We always talk about building familiarity and capacity. And so that's where we start. Then we go into this idea of thinking versus computing. So what's really interesting is that ChatGPT and other tools like Pi, which are meant to be like friendly, they look like they are thinking. They can respond and they can say, "Hey, Aaron, I remember you," like in this chat. And so, but they're not actually thinking. They are computing. They're just computing in a way that just is generative and or we can call it creative. And so the way that we teach about that is that give it a game, for example, give it a structure that is relatively easy for a human to follow. So celebrity heads, a yes, no game. Pick, I'm going to say I'm going to be Beyonce. You have to figure out who I am with only yes or no questions. You have 20 questions. You and I can do this very easily. A 5-year-old could do this. It's something that like it's a very kind of basic game. But if you give it to ChatGPT or other generative AI tools, what'll happen is it can't follow. It'll try to cheat. It will change the rules. It will forget. It doesn't count, so it doesn't know what number it's on. And it's actually pretty funny. So in our, demo of the game, we actually felt bad by accident and gave it a hint without meaning to because it was like doing so poorly. But what it does is it shows this very simple thinking piece that it can't do. And so you get to understand that this is still a computer program and you have to be very cautious. The third thing is we've been talking about hallucinations. So hallucinations, because it is predictive, is when it makes stuff up because it's just trying to tell you what it's thinking, right? It's trying to tell you what you think it should say. And so it can be quite good at, simple math, but it's not doing math. All it is doing is predictive every word or every sentence, depending on what model you're using. And so it gets it right sometimes because the training data that will say 2 + 2 = 4 a billion times. So it's pretty sure that's correct. And so what'll end up happening though is instead of it saying, I don't know, what it will do is it will make it up. So things like URLs, facts, citations, whether, it could tell you that like Amanda wrote a book, I've not written a book, things like that. And so we teach about that through hallucinations. So students actually get to try a couple of prompts that are very common. They're an expert on something and they ask, like whether it's a game or a person, they ask a bunch of questions to the AI, and what'll happen is it gets it wrong. And, it gets it wrong, maybe a little bit or maybe a lot if it's after 2021, which is a lot of training sets go. So that's 3. And then the last thing is like, what does this actually mean for you? So the way we ended is how can you think about your own policy of use? So you've learned about what it can do, what it can't do. You've seen how cool it is, the limitations, etc. So now how are you going to responsibly use this? And so what ends up happening is students co-create those policies. And so they're thinking through appropriate use, they're thinking through worked examples, what it does, what we hope it does, is it's like really cool and interesting. It's kind of fun. It's silly at times, which we all love that moment where something breaks in a funny way because the students will remember that. But then they also learn like how they're going to apply that to their own practice. And there are agentic beings in that space. It is not happening to them. They are getting to make a choice to say, like, I want, this is going to be a consequence, or these are places I really like help. And this is like, can we work together to create a space where that is the AI move, where I personally struggle with refining a text or thinking up a thesis statement. Can I use this for my own practice to brainstorm? If I keep track of it, if I show you my prompts, if I do it in a way that is thoughtful and productive, instead of just saying no, blanket no. And I think that that's where it really gets special, because then again, this is that opportunity to democratize access to computing, right? And to building, creating. That shouldn't just stop with teachers, but also hopefully be a huge part of students' experience, because it's going to be there in industry no matter what happens.
Right. Yeah, I love that. Gosh, there's so much there. And at first, I'll just say in the show notes for those listening, and those that listen already know this, I will put links to those lessons that you've talked about. I've been sharing those out. And I know in particular that that co-creation of policy with student lesson, I just freaking love. And I've been working with some admin, and I'm like, you guys need to do these lessons for your own learning as adults, and then you need to go back and then start to think about how you can bring the student voice in, because that's just as vital. Because I think there's also a misconception that every kid is using this to cheat. And I've been trying to talking with, I'm not going to say it's thousands of kids, but lots of like students and different conferences. And you were part of I think the one conference that was hosted by students. And I mean, just the idea of like, yes, kids are on social media. Yes, they're on their phones, but they're like, I think about my own children, like they are private. It's a private use. Like, yes, they're on it, but it doesn't like go out. It's not like my generation where we're like, hey, on Facebook, everybody look at what I'm eating. Everybody look, hey, I'm here. Like, it's very like kind of private. And not every kid is like, yeah, this is great. Some have some issues with this. Some think it's cheating. And so I think there's to bring their voice in and to assume that every kid's going to use it because it's a quick way out is really a disservice to our students or our younger populations, because they have a lot of thoughts and ideas around it. And I know even just talking with I have a high school, got a college, high school, and junior high. So they all kind of have, different thoughts, whether they care or do and whatnot. But I wanted to build off of what you said earlier. And I'm curious on this cognitive type of offloading, so to speak. I just interviewed a gentleman, and I'll put his name in the show notes. His name is Justin. Talked about this extended mind philosophy. Are you familiar with this at all? I'm going to say it like as if I know what it is. I mean, I literally just learned about it a few days ago. It's this whole notion that like we can offload our cognitive brain, like our learning, our intelligence doesn't just have to be in the brain itself. And the example he used was like, take the pencil or the written language. Up until that point, everything was kind of in our brains, but now we've been able to offload our thinking and our thoughts that can transcend even time. Like, so even when I pass away, my blog and my ideas still exist. And his idea, not to get too long-winded in this, is like AI is this next kind of extended mind philosophy where we can now extend what we can cognitively do with these new tools. And his example that he uses is Iron Man. So I'll explain this really quick, and then I'm curious on your thoughts based on what you just said. And if you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, we can just cut this out. But he talks about Iron Man, and this is where my head's been spinning a lot and making me rethink some of my stuff I've been sharing on AI. Is you've got Tony Stark, right? But like Tony Stark by himself, I don't know if you're a superhero junkie, but clearly I am with my backdrop, is not Iron Man. He's this billion-dollar philanthropist and, kind of cool guy, or, whatever you want to think of Tony Stark. But he himself is not Iron Man. But then you've got the Iron Man suit. But that suit itself is also not Iron Man. It's just a really, really expensive piece of metal and technology. But by itself, it's nothing. And then he's got Jarvis, which is like the AI interface. But even that by itself doesn't work. But when you put them all together, you now have Iron Man. You have like the human, you have the technology, and you have the AI all working, which allows Iron Man then to make these decisions to do good or bad or whatever. Okay, so there's my nerdy little thing. But this has me thinking a lot about this, thinking about AI. I'm thinking about the next wave of students where AI is going to be integrated in everything. And how much do we help teach them how to use AI? Because it's not going away. It's going to be more integrated than ever before. And is this part of this kind of like extended mind philosophy concept? I don't know where I land on it. You may not, you might be like, I have no idea what you're talking about, and we can move to a next question. But I'm just curious. My coffee's flowing
Yeah,
in the morning. Like
you're
when you
ready.
do that, like what do you like? What comes to mind for you through all the work and research you do?
Yeah, well, I think that when you talk about the pencil, right? There's a reason why it's easier to talk than to write. There's actually a cognitive change that happens when you're writing. The mind-body connection, the way that you're like the way that you have to think about the permanence of what you're doing, the way in which you like frame the letters, like there's a lot that goes into that. I think that is different than typing on a keyboard, that it's still something that we do, and that will be the primary approach to these, including like moving even to voice. And so I'm not sure that it's going to have the same difference of like the actual cognitive component of it, where we're stretching and our minds are becoming different in a more positive way. I think what's going to end up is that potentially we're going to do less. Like we're going to actually like maybe not write anymore, and there's going to be some changes there where we're going to see some pruning that happens. I think that the one kind of way that's really struck me is to think about this is that, and the thing I get most excited about is that and Mark Andreessen, who I don't always agree with, but has a nice way of framing this, that there are three epochs of computing. The first is when microchips happened, and when microchips happened, we had computers. Is that the cost of computing went from enormous machines with people like literal human power of like putting in these large piece of paper, and it was
Yeah.
huge, to zero. But it costs a lot to zero. So now I have a laptop, I have a desktop, I'm able to buy it once, I'm able to do my work. And so that's brought the marginal cost of compute to zero, right? Then the next is the internet. And the internet took the cost of distribution to zero, meaning like I built AI for Education as a website, and that was all I needed to do, plus social media, to be able to build a business. And so I brought the distribution to zero. Before, it was like people literally traveling salesmen and women going around the world, or like phone calls, or like, oh my gosh, junk mail, like what are other places that people got in front of you. And now what we have is the marginal cost of creating is going to zero, potentially with generative AI. So I no longer need to have a team of 25 engineers to build a website, not well, the website, but to build a large technology tool, like, or a website. I don't need to have a front engineer, a back end engineer. I can just use it now literally with words. There are website generators are not very good, but you can do it in a sentence. And so, we're going to see like, we're going to see a real increase of the worth and the value of these tools pretty quickly, for all kinds of reasons, because you can actually have a ChatGPT or other tool code for you. And while it's not perfect, it is a lot faster than coding on your own. So
Right.
all that's to be said is that there are these opportunities now to create in ways that have never been possible before. And so we can talk about, accessing technology in ways that are be low to no bandwidth. There are going to be models that you'll be able to download to your computer. And if you live in an area with low bandwidth or no bandwidth, and you go to you have a place where you can download it, and then you can work off that, and it can help you with your own creation of whatever you're doing. That's going to be pretty amazing, and that's going to be a hope, if we can keep these things free or low cost, that we will be in a position where there'll be a democratization of access. But on the other end is that there is extraordinary risk that what's going to happen is the McKinsey put out a report that 80% of jobs are going to be outdated or removed from our industry because of generative AI tools. The majority of those 80% of those jobs, that are going to be, well, I think by 80% of the jobs that are going to be lost, I think it's 40% of jobs, but 80% of jobs going to be lost are those that are held by women or people of color.
Yeah.
Because we're starting to go after these white collar positions like copywriting. There's going to be paralegals, things that are very like text based, that are become more and more like those skills are going to be degraded or downgraded, and as a skill set for the future. is that there's that component of like, what are we training students for and what kind of jobs in the future they'll be, and will we really invest in that? But then the other end is going to be, what does school become?
Yeah.
We don't start here. I'll be honest. It's
Right.
we're very deliberate in a practical approach. I do not go into a school and say, hey, rethink everything. It's done.
Yeah, right.
And I suggest you don't do that either. But I will say that when I do these PDs, there's one or two people in the room that realize that the things that they're teaching kids right now are not the things they need to be teaching, because we don't know what that is yet. And so we hope that, like, through the practical approaches and the capacity building, that we can have these deeper discussions about what are actually the skills of the future. What are we teaching students? How will schools change? How will we move past the 5-paragraph essay that a chatbot can do at higher fidelity than pretty much any human at this stage? How do we distill what actually is important to society, to learning, to creation, to happiness, to fulfillment? And how does that become school? And so that is, to me, like our underlying current of why we started AI for Education, is this opportunity to help us build capacity really quickly in an area in which it can be quite hard, so that we can have the much more important discussion of how are we preparing students in an equitable, ethical fashion to be able to be successful adults in a world that has changed so dramatically and will continue to change faster than we can see it or understand it.
I love it. I love it. I love it on a lot of levels of what you're talking about there, because as you're talking about all these tools, and we're talking about how we can expedite so much of that stuff, which is always pros and cons to everything. I mean, you can already start to see it now. I've seen it in emails. You start to see it in different newsletters and blog posts I read. I use AI to help clean up some of my writing and thinking. Don't get me wrong, I'm not going to sit here and act like I'm above it, but you start to already feel like everything's starting to sound kind of the same. And I don't mean that in a disrespect to anybody using the tools. And one of the things that I do, even AI, outside of the AI realm, I'm real passionate about inquiry, wonder, authentic and project-based learning. That is where my heart and soul live. AI is my new rabbit trail that I wake up and get my dopamine hits when I see the 14 new updates every 10 minutes, because it is in my nerd wheelhouse. But I think there's a great reminder for the importance of what we're so good at as humans, and that's that, like, our own unique flavor, our own unique voice, and our own capacity for thinking based on our life experiences and where life takes us. I mean, thinking about when you introduce yourself, like, all your journeys have brought you to this point that you have a perspective and a process of thinking that nobody else has, and I think that, to me, when I think about education, and I agree it's not a redesign, but how do we help people find and discover whatever that quote unquote it is? Because these tools can help expedite some things, but after a while, it's going to get real old, kind of hearing the same kind of structures and patterns, because it is algorithm based. Yes, I know you can put them in different roles and voices and all that kind of stuff, but you can start to feel already the saturation of, you can see the structures, or you can see somebody share out something and it's like, that is not who Amanda is. That's not how they write. I don't know what that is, but that's not her. No, I'm not saying you've done that. And so I'm bringing that up, as you think about that human piece. I think I agree with everything you're saying there. I think that's, as I think about education, is how do we help people find their voice? What's your story? What is your story? And how do we use what we have to teach, our standards, all that stuff, to help people kind of figure out who they are and who they want to be? And so there's my soapbox. I don't know, that's not necessarily a hot take. It's more of a soapbox, but that's where
I've got a lot of those too. I'm going to buy a soapbox and I'm going to put AI for Education on the side of it, because I really enjoy standing on it. So it's going to be it's going to be one of the things we buy.
Yeah. So I do want to be respectful of time, because I know you're incredibly busy, but I'm thinking the time of this recording, school's either back or teacher in-service is starting, or it's about to be, depending on where you are. I'm thinking about, as we connected earlier, about the Facebook group, which is incredible. But there is a lot of questions and posts, whether it's about slides or whatever it might be. And it's not going to be long until we get to like conferences and different things where there's like, hey, here's 100 AI tools in 50 minutes and this type of stuff. How are you hosting, or not hosting, but how are you having those conversations as you're speaking with schools and things? There are some incredible tools, don't get me wrong, and there's some that I like to share and promote. But I feel like sometimes with anything with tech, and it's one of my fears, people are going to jump to the tools before kind of truly understanding some of the basic foundations of how these tools work and things to think about. How are you handling and operating that? Because you start to see it real fast. All of a sudden, like, take the slide stuff. And there was just one posted the other day and there was like 50 comments. And I'm like, I recognize some of the tools, but there was like 15 tools I never heard of. And I'm like, but a week ago, that same question was posted. And I'm not even sure those tools even existed. And they could be great. I'm not dissing any tool, any creator of any of that stuff, but it's just like, my fear is like, we just get bombarded with, hey, here's a whole list of 100 tools, and we don't even process the implications of AI in that broader scale.
Yeah, I think this is real. Like, there's so much noise, and that's why I actually started building a generative AI tool. And then I realized a couple things. There's no clear winner, so it's not clear who's going to win. Like, is this like all these tools that are being created? Do they actually have value outside of like when Microsoft, Google Classroom, big players that have access to enormous amounts of money? Because the thing that people don't recognize is that this is very expensive. So all these tools that you might be using or looking at cost the cost of actually doing this type of computing is so much more than normal computing, especially if it's complex and they have to use a GPT-4 or more complex models. And so that's why you get asked to spend $10 or whatever, because these are very, very expensive tools. If you know anything about like building a business that's a software as a service business, usually your costs really are only like AWS and like how much storage you have and how flexible your database is. So if it gets really busy, you can, not knock people out. But it's not that expensive, incremental, and it's incremental versus something like GPT-4, which is very, very expensive, and why people have tokens. And so that's something to consider, is that a lot of people are going to be asking you to pay for stuff right now, even if it's not that good. And anyone that tells you that they have a tool that has no hallucinations and no bias and works all the time is not telling you the truth. So I'm willing to say that, hot take number 3, I don't pay for anything. I only pay for GPT-4 only because I run a company where I have to show it. I do like Code Interpreter, but otherwise I would be using only free tools at this stage. And we do not actually endorse anyone. Not saying that there's not immediate value. We're doing a webinar with a tool this week. I have, we do want to make sure that we're supporting the ecosystem, but schools should not be buying these tools yet and they're actually going to be launching this responsible AI badge for we're building a micro credential for educators who want to be able to bring this back to their own practice, to their school, because there's really no place to go yet to get that training and get that baseline. And then on the other end, what we are doing is the responsible AI tech tool badge. And what this means is that these companies, and we have something that can be put into the notes of the top 6 questions to ask EdTech, but it needs to be like, these programs need to have a commitment to lowering hallucinations and bias, to student privacy, or just privacy and transparency of the models, to progress, meaning that they're willing to update and share and recognize that this is a work in progress, that nothing is set in stone, and that they are committed to efficacy and effectiveness and evidence base. And if you can say that, then the tools I'm talking to that are willing to do that and to put it front and center in what they're doing and acknowledge that things don't work all the time, instead of saying this is this great tool, it's going to fix everything, then we feel at least that there's an opportunity to have less noise and that people can make better decisions. But again, I would not spend my money on these tools unless you absolutely love it, or but always with the knowledge that it's not going to be fit for purpose, because there is no foundational model that everything is built on that is unbiased or less biased than the internet, and no model that's going to be fully appropriate, including Conmigo. You can trick Conmigo to tell you to have inappropriate content. It can be quite poor and it's quite expensive. and or things that are going to say that they do not hallucinate, that they do not make things up. It's getting better in some cases with different types of approaches, but realistically, we're in this world where generative AI is the worst it will ever be. But it does mean that it is a brand new technology. And even though it does some things amazingly, it does a lot of things not so great. And there's a ton of research that shows all the things I'm talking about. You know, the most recent one is that there's a political test of 62 questions that is kind of a basic test. And researchers asked the foundational models these questions. And what they found is that they were on a political spectrum. So ChatGPT was more libertarian. Llama 2, which is Meta's, was more conservative. And when they weren't able to do this at the models that we use today because they're very complex and they're not open, but they were able to use some of the older models to then say, okay, if you're already on the spectrum, what if I train you with data that's very similar to the spectrum, like right wing or left wing? And what happened is those models became more right wing and more left wing. They became better at identifying inconsistencies on the other side of the spectrum, but worse at identifying their own. Like the own inconsistencies or falsehoods on their own. So these are examples of what happens. And so we have to be super cognizant. And I don't want to say that we talk about being responsibly optimistic. I am optimistic, and I hope we take our course or use our prompt library. Almost everything we do is free because apparently I'm not very good at business yet. But it's purposeful for that equity component. But what I would say is that you also have to deeply understand the limitations, be agentic, understand that like you have autonomy, you can make decisions, that students should be taught not just that this could help them like learn English better, but that this also is something that has entrenched bias that can mess up, that is something to be critically consumed. And so I just think that there's that balance. And what that means though is that it's very, very hard to navigate. So if I know we're coming up on time, if I can leave everybody with like a positive next step, is that be comfortable with the fact that it's changing, that you don't need to be an expert, that all you need to do is build capacity, be open and curious, and be willing to try things out and to have dialogue with your colleagues, with your students, with your admins, with your family, and normalize this. Because the worst thing that could possibly happen is students are doing this on their own because there's not a space to do that in the classroom, that teachers are ostracized because they're embracing it and other ones don't feel comfortable. And so there's now that, degrading like of that relationship, or that we have these experiences in which your feedback is not being given to the people that are building these models. And if anybody tells you that Sam Altman is doing it for the good of the world, he's doing it to make money. And he's already making a lot of money, but he's going to make even more. So we have voice right now to like actually have a conversation about what works or doesn't work and what we want before we accept this wholesale as a fit for purpose tool within our classrooms and education systems.
I love it. Keep preaching. I love it. Yeah. And I think it's, and I would say like one thing to add to that is like, I think there is a real need and urgency as we all navigate the unknown, and who knows what things will look like and shake out, and all the players seem to change on a daily basis with whatever's going on. But there's a real urgency, I think, in education, though, to continue to build in conversations around AI, not just with our colleagues, but also our students. As I think about making sure that we are building an awareness around these very topics, so that students have an opportunity to have a voice at the table, if they so choose to be there. And if we don't, to me, in my mind, I think that's with anything of authentic learning, if we don't provide those opportunities and they don't know what they don't know, then how do we start to continue to have deeper conversations around the bias and the ethics? And not that we're going to magically change that and just a little bit of stuff, but there's I think a real need in all schools where we can have conversations with all students, which means all shapes and sizes, colors, ethnicities, all the things, to just be like, hey, like this stuff matters. And the younger generations prove time and time again they do care and they are passionate about the world. And AI is another space for them to voice their ideas and concerns, because I think they do care about the earth. And maybe to some degree, I think about my own children. They're not they're not extraordinary special. I mean, I think they are a little bit unbiased, but I mean, but like they have an insight to the world that I never had, or you never had, just because of technology and the way the world is, which is good and bad. But they have real passions about things. And so I think there's, stuff for this. I think there is an obligation that we have. I'm not saying have these conversations with 5-year-olds, but as we think about, our social studies courses or language arts courses, it doesn't have to just be computer science, but ways to start to have, like, what does this mean? What's this look like? What are those thoughts? And, what does this mean? And I think there's a real opportunity there to, help people bring their voices, just like you said, while we have the opportunities before those opportunities get squashed by big money and all the major players. So, Amanda, I do want to be respectful of your time. I could continue to badger you with lots of questions here. This has been, as I said at the beginning, a true honor to have this opportunity to speak with you and learn from you here, as well as continue to learn from you and all the work you've got going on. We'll get all this stuff in the show notes, but if people want to learn more about you and your work and follow your journey, we'll get all the links in there. But as I always say, for those sitting at a red light that maybe want to go jump on and start following now, where are some of the best places to continue to learn from you and learn from all the incredible work that you guys continue to produce and create?
Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity. Like I said at the very top, this is what I think about all the time. And so it's good to be able to have conversations with people that so deeply care like you do, clearly. If you want to learn more, we have a website. It's aiforeducation.io. That has a whole bunch of free resources. Some of the more recent stuff we've done is we launched a free course a couple weeks ago that have about 1,500 people from around the world that have taken it. We've got a whole bunch of resources for the classroom, including the curriculum, but also the prompt library. We have about 50 prompts that, if like some tools that are paid, or like they have a lot of prompts that you can do. We have one that's just free that you go cut and paste. It tells you how to be creative. It gives you an example. It's really meant to be a place to get started and to like create that first light bulb moment, but also you have people that come back to it when they're looking for something specific and don't want to have to like keep putting that brain on building that best prompt. We've got a couple other things that are helpful, hopefully, in the sense of like we just released 2 things this last week around policy. So we have a student policy kind of flow chart where students can make good decisions about when and how to use AI in their own practice, as well as a guide to developing one at a school level or system level. And so those things are all free on our website. And if you want us to come in and actually have a chat with your team or do a workshop, we do a lot of those, both nationally and internationally. So that's kind of the best way. Also, LinkedIn is how I met Aaron. I didn't post on LinkedIn for 9 months, and actually it is not my comfort zone. This is one of those times, I guess, maybe if I can leave with leaning into the discomfort. I started posting again in, March-ish, and it's been pretty consistent, really focusing on like trying to provide high value stuff. And what's happened is, we're in a position now where I'm going to be a top voice in education. I think you're the first person that knows after Labor Day. And so it's very cool. But it's a good example of like sometimes if you're like right person, right place, hopefully right person, but right person, right place, right time, that the good things will happen. So if you're your own entrepreneur, you really want to get into this work, what I would suggest is like share the things that are really impactful and that are really like meaningful, and you'll get good things to come back to you.
Well, I love it. Keep doing all that you're doing. I've found a ton of value already from following your work and your journey, and I know I'll continue to do so. And that prompt library, just to put the icing on the cake there's a really good rubric prompt that could save teachers sometimes a good one to start with, and probably the very one you wish you had. Yeah,
it's the very first one I ever did, and I did not write it nearly as well, but when I did do this together, it was the first one I did. But thank you so much. I just have appreciated the time together.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning, chilling with coffee mugs, me and coffee chugs, talking education all across the nation, pushing boundaries, thinking innovation. Chaos.